All right, good morning, everyone. I can't believe it's already July and almost the end of July, and the heat is probably getting to me like it is to you all. But thank you for joining our 7th webinar in our volunteer management webinar series. This month, we are going to talk about volunteer retention and some strategies and tips and tricks on how to help keep your volunteers stay with the program a little bit longer. Excuse me, my name is Sydney Shetro, and I am the Director of Volunteer Services at the Tennessee Commission on Aging and Disability. I am not a volunteer expert. I like to tell everyone that. I definitely am doing research. Volunteer is something I'm extremely passionate about, but anything that I suggest that we talk about that maybe your peers are doing, by no means are you required to do in your programs. It's just kind of talking about some best practices that we have and that we've seen through some research. If you want to implement any ideas or activities that we discuss, make sure you approve it through supervisors and things of that nature, just to make sure everything kind of runs smoothly and that your volunteer programs can grow and prosper for the future. So with that, we like to start every month with a new recruitment tip of the month. So it's kind of the most popular topic when I surveyed a lot of you in the topics you wanted to talk about. So instead of just doing one presentation about it, we kind of do a little update every month. So this month, through a lot of the research, especially with how to recruit volunteers during a pandemic or during a crisis, they really talked about recruitment ambassadors. And these are looking at the current volunteers that you have who show a passion and enthusiasm for your mission. So those volunteers that even though, you know, the senior center's closed or you're not able to do in-person counseling or anything like that, they've really stepped up to the plate when things have kind of slowed down to continue to volunteer during a hectic time or an uncertain time. These volunteers may have unique connections in the community that you don't have. So one big example in any volunteer program that I've worked with, whether it's in a volunteer capacity or in a professional capacity, is we've always worked to get good connections and relationships with faith-based organizations. And it's difficult, I'm not going to say impossible, but many of you can probably attest to this. It's difficult to get into a faith-based organization unless someone already has a connection with that congregation or that organization. So a good volunteer ambassador has those unique connections. Maybe they're really involved in their church or a local civic organization, or it's a student in a university that can recruit other students, or social worker, someone in a hospital setting that may be able to recruit some people. So look at those individual connections of your volunteers. They're also reliable and engaged in their current volunteer role. So those are people that when they say, hey, I'm going to be there and deliver my meal every Friday or whatever rides, you know, they say I'm going to be able to schedule to take someone to the doctor, and they never miss an appointment. They never say, you know, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not able to do this because something unexpected happened, or they're just reliable, and you can really count on them to fulfill their commitments. And then it's also important that we supply them the resources as they're recruiting people. So maybe it's talking points or some kind of script or things to highlight as you're trying to recruit a fellow volunteer. Maybe they're doing a presentation and you can supply them, you know, when we're able to do back to in-person stuff. Supply them with some giveaways. Not necessarily, you know, little trinkets or anything like that, but I'm thinking more flyers and brochures and pamphlets and volunteer role descriptions and anything like that that they can give out to people who are interested in volunteering, so they have that more information, those takeaways to take home and review. So I'm kind of going to look in the chat box. I'll ask everyone some questions. You know, I try and like to make the webinars a little bit more interactive. So please open up your chat box, use that little chat bubble that you have there at the bottom of your screen, I believe is where it's at. And I'm curious if anybody has volunteer ambassadors currently. So like maybe 2 or 3 volunteers who really go out and help recruit other volunteers. It may be something that's brand new to a lot of us. I think it's a really good time right now that quite a few of our programs, not all programs, meals are still hot and heavy, rides, all that good stuff. They're still, volunteering on a daily, if not weekly basis. But maybe those programs that are, I don't want to say, stopped or paused, but I guess I'm kind of thinking like ombudsman and guardianship who, they would go into the nursing homes, and right now that's kind of limited a little bit. They're probably still making, phone calls to their people, but this may be a good time to do some training and recruit some of your current volunteers and say, hey, I'm willing to do a 1-hour training or a 30-minute training or whatever you all have time for if anyone's interested in learning how to be an ambassador for the program and help recruit volunteers. So not seeing anything in the chat box currently that people are doing it right now, so maybe it's something that we can start, and then maybe in a year or so we'll see and hear some success stories. So getting right into the content, so what is the definition of retention? I guess as I was doing research, I had my own kind of interpretation of what retention meant, and that's just a volunteer coming back every year to do some volunteer work. But I went to the expert, and I don't think I've mentioned this person's name in previous webinars, and I should have the very first webinar. But Susan J. Ellis is kind of the godmother of volunteer management. She's one of the prolific experts in volunteer management, and talk about ambassadors. She's very much advocated for volunteer management. Unfortunately, she passed away in February of last year of cancer, but she's done a lot of research. Almost anything that you see in terms of volunteer management either has her name or a collaboration, and she has a foundation and all sorts of stuff. But her definition of retention is keeping volunteers for the amount of time for which they committed at the start of their service. And that got me thinking right away that I personally, and this is just me and you all are probably much better volunteer managers than I am, when I created some volunteer role descriptions for the programs that I've worked in, when it comes to time of commitment or time of service, or however you word that in your volunteer role description, my definition is typically as long as the volunteer is willing and able to continue that service. So it's not necessarily a set amount of time. So I'm going to do one of my infamous polls. I haven't done a poll in a while. So hopefully everyone can open up their chat box because that's where it's going to show up. But I'm going to open a poll and ask you, what are your commitment times for your volunteer roles, if you have any? So I'm going to go ahead and open that poll. It should show up in the chat box or somewhere similar to that. Hopefully everybody can see it. I'm not an expert on the polls. Okay, we got some people who are answering. So a couple different options, generally 1 to 3 months, 3 to 6 months, 6 to 9 months, 9 months, 9 to 12 months, or a year or more. Or maybe some of you are like me and you really don't have any specific time frames, but you're definitely going to look into it in the future. Yep, someone in the chat box said open-ended, so definitely it's going to vary, absolutely, depending on that volunteer role description, definitely. So I'm going to give you guys about 20 more seconds for those of you who want to fill in and answer that poll. So it's good to see that a few people do have some time frames that are set. All right, the poll has ended. So let me look at those poll results. Is it 11? Maybe not. Okay. So we have one person who said generally 3 to 6 months, 3 people who are 9 to 12 months, 2 people who are 12 months or more. We've had 3 comments that kind of say it varies depending on the position or ongoing, it's open-ended. And then 14 of you are like me, who are going to go back and reevaluate and see if maybe we need to specify a start and an end date. So an example I can think of is with our Stay Active and Independent for Life program, the exercise class. It used to be ongoing. Kind of part of your commitment was doing a class for 2 years, which probably some of you who just heard that went, whew. And that's kind of what I did when I started with the program. But now we've been able to kind of look at what other states have done, and something you may want to look at too, and kind of talk with your peers in other states. Other states are doing 12-week programs. So instead of an ongoing commitment for 2 years, those volunteers are able to break up their class into 3-month increments. So maybe if they needed to take a break, they could take a break and come back. So good. I appreciate you guys filling out that poll and giving me your input. Definitely something to really consider just starting out the presentation. I was able to find some volunteer retention rates by states. So Tennessee is currently ranked 37 in the country for volunteer retention at about a 58.8% rate. When I looked at kind of the national, it was around 61%, 62%. So we're a little bit below the national average, but not by much. And it could be because people, like many of us, myself included, may not have that specific time frame that Susan Ellis kind of puts out there that factors into that retention rate. So maybe that'll increase as more people kind of specify that time frame. Oh, real quick. If you look at in the diagram, it says view more. Of course, I can't click that right now, but if you do view more, you'll get a lot more Tennessee volunteer data. And again, this is something I should have pointed out to everyone at the very beginning of this series, where you can find Tennessee-specific data on some volunteer measures. So maybe you're doing some grant research or something along those lines, or you have to do a presentation to a committee or something along those lines, so you can compare your volunteer retention rate or your volunteer rate in your community to all of Tennessee. So if you're interested in more of this data, you can go to the link below. It's in the PowerPoint that I sent you all, and I'll also send it in the follow-up email as well. So there is some national statistics that we can use as needed for any kind of our research that we have. Speaking of some national data, as I was going through the presentation, I thought a couple little things really stuck out to me that you guys may be interested in. So the first thing is volunteer retention by age. So kind of you can see just by using the chart a little bit, the younger the volunteer is, the lower the retention rate. The older the volunteer is, the higher the retention rate. So I can see that didn't necessarily surprise me. If you have other input or comments about the data, please feel free to put that in the chat box. But I can see, because kind of thinking back to like my high school years, I would volunteer in my local community, but then I went off to college and I wasn't able to come back and volunteer as much. Same thing in my 20s when I was in college. I volunteered a lot for for organizations in my college town, but then of course I left, I moved to Tennessee, and I'm not able to volunteer for those agencies anymore. And then of course working age, that kind of varies as well. So a question came in, how do they collect this data? This is also with the national service.gov. So I'm not exactly sure how they collect this data. I believe they do some surveys to many of their contacts. I can do some more research and see exactly how the data is collected. I'm not 100% sure how to answer that question. And then the second figure is volunteer retention and volunteer hours. So we've talked the last couple times about tracking volunteer hours to kind of show, volunteer recognition and importance in the program and their data, in-kind contributions, things like that. But I encourage you all to look at your volunteer hours and your retention rate side by side. Because again, this data didn't really surprise me either, that the more hours a volunteer serves at an organization, the higher their retention rate. Of course, the more that they're going to serve, the more engaged that they are, the more that they want to continue to serve. So maybe you'll be able to correlate this data with a volunteer who may be in their, younger than 30 and see that, okay, well, we're not retaining them as much. Maybe it's college students that you use for a semester. I can think of the State Health Insurance Assistance Program, or Tennessee SHIP, SMP. They use college students during open enrollment, and a lot of them graduate the next year, so we aren't able to retain them as much as we are maybe the service coordinators at low-income housing or senior housing facilities. So you can kind of correlate it that way. And again, here is the brief from the National Service .gov website that I found this data on. Hopefully that'll answer the question more on how the data is collected. But talking about retention strategies, so in order to retain your volunteers, the volunteers really need to have a sense of connection with you, with the mission, with the program itself, with the clients, just with so many people, with the other volunteers. So here are a few ways to help volunteers really get that sense of connection with your program. So we've talked about this a lot as well, and I know a lot of our webinars, we kind of almost repeat information every week, just in a different context. So as you're like, man, she talks about this every single month, know that if it comes up multiple times, it's probably even more important that we review that portion of the volunteer program. So input's extremely important. They want to have their voices be heard. A lot of volunteers don't like to voice their opinion because they may feel like their role isn't as significant or as important as a paid staff person's role in the organization. So they may not feel comfortable, or, maybe it's not my place, or I'm overstepping something if I put, my thoughts forward, or they don't have all the information that someone who is a paid staff person knows. But it's good for the volunteers, even if they don't have all the information, to share their ideas with you, and you're able to then communicate with them. I think that's a great idea. I really wish we could do it, but this and this and this may be a barrier to your idea. Let's work through and see how maybe we can overcome those barriers and see if your idea will be able to work. Or, a volunteer could have this, the silver bullet, as we like to call it, to solve a problem, but we want them to feel open and be able to communicate that to hopefully solve an issue that we've been trying to struggle with for maybe a while. Validation. So volunteers, people alike, we all want validation to know that what we're doing and saying is important. So positive comments about characteristics, things that they're doing is really important. It's kind of like recognition, saying a thank you, but being more specific. So some examples are, you have a really great work ethic. I'm really impressed with how you stayed calm in that really stressful situation. Maybe they're on the phone with a client and the client's upset and they're taking it out on the volunteer when, we've all had those rough phone calls where, we hang up and just say, you know what, I don't think I'm going to make any more phone calls today. That one was a little too rough. I'm going to focus on something else. But if the volunteer stays calm, they've had a good calming voice, they didn't get stressed or didn't get angry. Really, I'm really impressed with how you handled that. You're such a caring person. You're really good at problem solving, those kind of things. It's going to sound strange at first. So a lot of people, they don't go right to the validation comments. They almost go, it's easier to say something like, oh, that was really, man, that client was just really angry, and, what that person suggested was really stupid, or, kind of, people will say the negative almost more relaxed than saying something positive. So really working on some validation and validating comments to your volunteers will really help them stay connected. communicating contributions, we've talked about this a lot. In fact, we have a lot of people who've been doing this more and more. Thank you again to Keita Cole, who sent out or who sent me the edited version of their big impact statement about what they've done at the organizations during COVID-19. I know 2 or 3 organizations who've taken that and adapted it to their organization. The Johnson County Senior Center has done an amazing volunteer video that they posted on their Facebook page, so I encourage everyone to look at that. So really, those ways of communicating contributions to your volunteers are really impactful. I've had the comments that, the volunteers really enjoy it, the communities enjoyed it, our board of directors. So really communicating those contributions are going to help volunteers stay engaged and feel a sense of connection to your program. This one sounds like a no-brainer, but it's harder than what it sounds like. So addressing volunteers by their name. It's probably going to be easier for the programs that have a smaller number of volunteers, maybe of 10 to 20 volunteers in your small county. But the volunteer coordinators who are in charge of a statewide program that has hundreds of volunteers, or your local regional coordinators that have dozens, we tend to know the volunteer's name of those volunteers who volunteer on a regular basis or who are always kind of our go-to volunteers, but really making an effort to address all volunteers by name, whether that's making sure they have their volunteer tag, name tags, or something along those lines to help you. I know many name games and get to know you games. If you ever need any kind of fun ways to learn people's names, shoot me an email, give me a call, let me know, and I'll send you a whole bunch of resources on fun ways to remember everyone's names. Keeping everyone informed. This may be a weekly update. It could be your monthly newsletter to keep volunteers informed of what's going on, especially as we start to develop our new normal with the COVID-19 and all the safety precautions and everything that we're implementing. It's vitally important that volunteers are informed. Written and verbal would probably be most preferred. I know, and many of you have received my emails that are rather long, and I'm guilty of this as well. The longer the email, the more I'm skimming, and the less I'm really reading and retaining necessarily. So that's why I say if it's going to be a long, precautions and policies and new things that are going to be in place, it's great that they have it written. But it also may be a good idea to do a webinar or a conference call or get a large group together and maybe verbally talk to them and inform them of new things that are going on as well. Sincere and consistent recognition. We've talked about this as well. Just a regular thank you every time a volunteer comes into the office or does a presentation for you or anything like that. Just saying it and making sure that it's sincere instead of just saying, hey, thanks for being here. Thank you for coming in and filing all that paperwork. It would have taken so long for me to do. And with your help, I was able to get this, and this done. And it's just, you're really helping the program by allowing me to be able to do other things. Or I'm sure you can figure out way better examples than that one. And then sharing volunteer experiences. So allowing the volunteer to be able to share their experiences with other people, whether it be new volunteers coming in. Maybe you ask a volunteer to come in every day of an orientation or every day of an initial training, a new volunteer with a new experience every time. So the new people coming in are more energized and motivated to volunteer with the program because their peer has shared how important this experience is to them. Or if you're at a board of directors meeting or advisory council or whatever, governing body you have at your organization, have a volunteer come in and share their experience, or ask volunteers to write down their experience and then kind of pass the paper to a couple of your board members. and ask them to read it out loud to the group. Gets kind of the board interactive and involved, but those experiences are being shared. There was a really good article. It was actually 2 articles, and I'm trying to keep things more on the positive because we are going to talk about kind of the negative and what not to do. But there's a really great article, and I forgot to scan it in, and I'm going to try and do my best to get it to you guys in the follow-up email. But there's a part 1 and a part 2 article about volunteer retention. It's called "What Makes Them Stay," and then "Why Do They Leave?" So a couple more things just to kind of emphasize the sense of connection, and it's also things that we talked about in the past as well. But understanding that volunteer motivation, knowing why they're volunteering for your program, skills development. A lot of the professional volunteers want to volunteer for our organizations to get some more experience. I know I volunteer quite a bit for some fundraising events because that's not really my strong suit. I don't like asking people for money or fundraising in a certain way. So I like to volunteer for big events like conferences and things to try and figure out some more ways to be comfortable with fundraising aspects. So any type of skill development that we can correlate with why the volunteer wants to be with our program is great. Personal growth, volunteers like to be challenged. So we need to, volunteers who say they want to do admin work, they know that part of that is filing and data entry, but maybe to challenge them a little bit, they can start analyzing some of the data that they're entering, looking at those retention rates for you, trying to figure out any trends that they see in the data to make it just a little bit more challenging on the administrative front. They love that contact with the clients that we serve. They love taking those individuals to the doctors for the My Ride program, or delivering those weekly or daily meals to their individuals on their route to check in on them, things like that. So there's just a few more reasons why volunteers stay. And I think all of us do this. I don't think that we intentionally drive the volunteers away. We try and make them feel connected to our program. There are a couple other ways that we may not have thought about that's more methodologies. I'm not very good with methodologies, but I thought that these would be helpful. So the first one is a day in the life. Now, with the pandemic and everything going on, we may actually be doing this and not necessarily looking at it from a volunteer's perspective, but taking a walk in the volunteer's shoes by completing a volunteer shift. So it may be delivering a meal, or taking someone for a ride, or attending an event, doing a presentation, whatever your volunteer roles are. If you haven't in a while, do that volunteer role. Or if you are currently doing it, we're kind of the subject matter experts on our volunteer opportunities. So if we're like, okay, well, this is easy, I can do this. I don't know why a volunteer may not want to do this job or role. Maybe you get someone who you're really close with. It could be a best friend, a spouse, a parent, a sibling, and say, hey, I need your help. I need you to do this volunteer role just one time. You're not going to necessarily be a regular volunteer unless you really enjoy it and you want to continue. But I need you to come in on your next day off, or whenever you have a free time during the week, and I need you to deliver this meal route for me. And I'm going to train you, and you're going to go through all the protocols and everything that you would normally do for a volunteer. And have them do that, and then the person that you're picking is going to give you that honest, open feedback. And they're going to say, hey, this was really great. You really could have buffed this up in the training maybe, but really getting kind of your own perspective, putting yourself in the volunteer shoes, or getting someone that you really trust to do kind of a day in the life of the volunteer and get some feedback on that. Voice of the volunteer, so facilitating a focus group. We've talked about focus groups before. I found this diagram that I thought was really great. I've personally never done a focus group. I think I could facilitate one, but at the same time, I don't know all the ins and outs of focus groups. So we may be able to find a mediator if anyone wants to do a focus group. I know there's a lot of resources out there, but if we're interested, participants contribute equally, and they feel comfortable to interact openly and say how they really feel. So I know we have brainstorming sessions with our volunteers, and we talk about all sorts of things. And most of our volunteers, we have that good relationship, and they're open and willing to talk about, obstacles and things that they feel like they can improve upon. But maybe having a more professional mediator come in and do that could get you some even better results from those focus groups. Or, of course, kind of do what you're already doing. And it doesn't have to be formal. It could be informal, but getting that input from a focus group. This is something that I've always wanted to do, and I just haven't been able to do it as I've moved from program to program, unfortunately. So volunteer advisory committees. So I think this is really good for maybe our statewide coordinators who kind of oversee a larger program, or maybe if you have regional coordinators, the East, Middle, and West Grand Region coordinators may want to come together. But get an advisory committee going of your volunteers. So maybe a representative or two, depending on how many roles you have, that are kind of not necessarily the spokespeople, but they represent each volunteer role. They're kind of like the ambassadors, they're really dedicated, they're reliable, they love the mission and the program, and you really get their input and hear their voice and see how we can collaborate more. Maybe as they talk to each other, we realize, okay, we have 3 volunteer roles that do similar things. Maybe we can combine those into 2 and kind of get the volunteers' input that way. So I always thought those advisory committees were such a great idea. I just had never really been able to implement those. And then we talk about surveys a lot, and not everyone likes a survey. Some of us find surveys rather tedious. I fill them out as best I can. But it's really important not just to do a, hey, how do you all like to be recognized? Hey, how can we do better in our retention efforts? But surveys don't have to go to every single volunteer that you have in the program. So, for example, maybe we do targeted surveys that 2 months after the orientation, we see that 5 volunteers didn't come to the initial training. Let's see if we can give those 5 people a survey, see if they would tell us or give us input on why they didn't come to the initial training. Maybe it was something about orientation, they didn't feel comfortable, or it was just a scheduling conflict. Let me know when the next initial training is. After someone's gone through the initial training, maybe 3 months, hey, how are you doing? Are you satisfied with your volunteer role? Is there anything we can do to challenge you a little bit more? And then maybe to all the volunteers, an annual satisfaction survey or something like that. So I know personally, I've always thought, I want all the volunteers to be able to answer all these questions. But it could be that I just need to designate a few volunteers, especially in those volunteer roles. So if I have volunteers who are only doing presentations, I'm not going to have the volunteers who haven't done a presentation since their volunteer role started. I'm not going to send that survey to them. So kind of targeting those surveys to get their voices heard, as we talked about, is a good way to connect them and to improve the program as well. So there was an article through Volunteer Pro, which is another really great volunteer resource. That's kind of the 5 unappreciated reasons why volunteers quit. So we kind of have the basics of why volunteers may leave. So going back to that, what I kind of talked about with those 2 articles, why they stay and why they go. So kind of the basic reasons in a sense. basic. The appearance of an office workspace. So if it's not clean or, you don't have a workspace for them, equipment quality, maybe the training and orientation weren't as specific as what they needed to be. Communication's not all that great. There's not all those updates to keep them connected. Working conditions, interpersonal relationships, things like that are a lot of, they may not feel comfortable talking to the volunteer coordinator, or there may be in and out groups, cliques in the current volunteers that they don't feel comfortable, integrating into the volunteer group, which we're going to talk about. So these are 5, I think she named the article unappreciated ways. So there's going to be some fancy language. But competency is one of the first ones. So we've talked in the past about knowledge, skills, and abilities. Those are the 3 things we need to make sure volunteers have in order to be successful in their volunteer role. And we want all of our volunteers to be successful. So if they need to have access to a computer, or they need to have basic computer skills, but they're not very tech savvy, they may not have the competency to perform that volunteer role. So making sure that, especially if it's anything skills-based, that's really covered in the orientation, and then especially in the initial training, and making sure the volunteer is comfortable. So some questions to ask yourself about if you have the competency kind of solid, so volunteers don't leave because of competency. Do volunteers receive adequate training to feel comfortable in their roles? Do they have the right tools for the right job? What other tools and support can you offer? And is your workspace a safe place to ask questions? And are you and other staff, your colleagues, approachable? This could be something you add to one of those surveys, those questions. Participation efficacy. Basically, this is, does the volunteer feel like the work that they're doing is effective and really correlating to that mission and the goal of why the program's around? So is their work designed to be efficient with minimal bureaucracy and roadblocks? That's probably a tough one. Do you report and celebrate the volunteers for reaching each goal? I always think when a lot of articles will say celebration of a goal, I always think of those, typically it's done with fundraising goals. You have a big poster on the wall that has that thermometer, and you're able to fill in until the thermometer explodes and all the mercury or whatever's in the thermometer kind of explodes up at the top. So that may be something that, hey, our goal is to counsel 15,000 Medicare beneficiaries, or do 5,000 rides, or deliver 10,000 meals, or whatever it is. If you have something that's visible that volunteers can see, that's on a wall, and they come in and they're going to be delivering meals to 10 people. Hey, you want to go over to the thermometer and you shade in the 10 people that you're going to be delivering meals to, or kind of getting them not only to feel that what they're doing is effective, but actually doing something physical that shows them, because you're delivering these 10 meals, our goal, we're literally getting closer and closer to that goal. Something to consider. Group integration. So the social aspect of volunteering is really important. We did a survey last month kind of ranking what's important in your priorities for volunteering, your motivations. Social was kind of my lowest, but it's really important because if I am going to volunteer, especially with a group, but I don't like the group, I'm not going to stick around all that much. So making sure that new volunteers are fully integrated into a larger group. Do you actively work against the formation of cliques and insider groups? Is everyone kept in the loop with emerging information? We talked about that a little bit earlier. And how do you address volunteer and paid staff relationships if issues arise? So if you have a coworker who's just like, I really don't like that volunteers are in the office, we can do this. We don't need volunteers around. Have you kind of had the conversation with that coworker that I know you feel this way, but I really need you to appreciate when the volunteers come in. You know, if they say hi back, stuff, be civil sort of stuff. So not only are they integrated into the other volunteers that have been with the program maybe longer, but they're comfortable around the other staff. Making sure that you have support for all age groups. Different age groups need different things. There is some research that shows in terms of support for, acknowledging work and getting feedback on performance, volunteers who are over 40 don't need as much of that support, like I don't want to say micromanaging, but the performance reviews and stuff like that. They don't need that type of support to be retained. Granted, it's a good practice to have for your volunteer program to make sure everyone's meeting the volunteer role descriptions, but it's more our younger volunteers that need that help and that reinforcement that what they're doing is good and helpful, and that feedback. So the questions to ask yourself for the younger volunteers: do you have a plan to provide more in-depth supervision and support? And then do you have a feedback system in place to help volunteers make connections and work more effectively? So those are some questions to ask about that. And the last one is the perception of voice. So we talk about this one a lot, making sure that the voices of the volunteers are heard. Those who feel valued and heard tend to have a better decision-making skills and have positive views of authority, set more goals, and experience increased cooperation. So those people who feel that they're really involved, you may not be able to implement every suggestion that they have, but you listen to them, you say, hey, I'm going to follow up on that, and you actually do, and you have to do that follow-up. That's really, really important. That's something that I've struggled with in the past, that I've worked on hopefully doing better. So questions to ask yourself: are you listening to your volunteers, not just their voices, but their body language? So that's really important. Maybe if you do a focus group or you have a brainstorming session, you look at the body language of your volunteers as well as what they're saying. Are you paying attention to how they interact with peers? Are they all in a group, or do you have one or two volunteers that really like to just kind of sit by themselves and not really interact with anybody? And do you have systems in place to identify and respond to burnout before it leads to resignation? Speaking of burnout, that's the next thing that we're going to talk about. Because in all the research, volunteer burnout is a huge cause and reason why volunteers are not retained. Now, this is just really kind of general information about burnout overall. So what we're going to talk about the last 15 minutes or so before we get to questions can really be applied to not only volunteers, but can also be applied to yourself, maybe your coworkers. So it can be applied in many different ways. So volunteer burnout is when someone is emotionally, physically, and mentally exhausted. There's many different causes to this, but it's kind of that they're burnt. I mean, there's no better way than just to say they're burned out. They're tired. They don't feel that what they're doing is effective, is making a difference, and things like that. It's not necessarily anything that you have done or the volunteer program has done. So I really want to start talking about volunteer burnout in not taking blame or feeling like you're responsible, that, oh, I put too much pressure on the volunteer, or it's my fault that they're no longer volunteering for us. There's multiple factors, and we're going to talk about those. So don't take it personally necessarily if a volunteer experiences burnout, unless as you're looking through it, you're like, oh, yeah, I was a huge contributing factor to the burnout. So causes of burnout. Work-related, so this can also be your volunteer work. Literal no control, We don't recognize them like we should. Our expectations are demanding and maybe burdensome in a way. What they're doing is really not challenging, monotonous, the same thing all the time, kind of boring. Or, I mean, there's certain times of the year that things are just chaotic at high pressure. We had a comment come in, Medicare open enrollment. Absolutely. For our SHIP SMP staff people, we know open enrollment is a very stressful time. Lifestyle. So again, this has to do with their lifestyle, not necessarily what's going on in the volunteer program, but they work too much. They don't socialize or relax and give themselves time to kind of decompress. They don't have those supportive relationships or those close relationships. They take on too much without any help, and they're not getting enough sleep. And then personality. So many of these things I can relate to. Being a perfectionist, nothing you ever do is good enough. You should have done it this way would have been better. Why didn't I think of this idea? A pessimistic view on yourself or the world. Probably seeing that a lot more right now, just with so much that's going on, people can kind of get a negative view. So hopefully people are able to see the positive. But the need to be in control and the reluctancy to delegate. Oh, that's me to a T. I'm such a control freak. Oh, it's terrible. So these are some of the causes. And as you can see, not all of them are going to relate to you or your volunteer program. So again, don't put all the pressure and the blame on yourself. So there are some signs that we can look out for. Emotional signs are a little bit harder to see than some of the other signs we're going to talk about. So sense of failure or self-doubt. It may be a volunteer doesn't meet a deadline, and you're like, oh, it's okay. I'll give you another week extension. Hopefully, we give volunteers a deadline that isn't make or break for a deadline for you. So, for example, if you need volunteers to report their data, give them 2 weeks to report it before your report is due. That way, if a volunteer, takes them an extra week to get you that data, you don't have as much pressure, and you can tell them, hey, no big deal. I can give you an extra week, but try not to make that a habit. But if they do miss that deadline and they are just beating themselves up, that's one of those signs. Feeling helpless, trapped, and defeated. Detached. Maybe they don't come around as much anymore. They don't talk to you like they used to. You don't have those conversations you normally would have. Loss of motivation. Hey, I need you to deliver 10 meals. I'm really not feeling it. Can I only deliver 5? When usually they're like, hey, I want to do 15. 10's too little. So you can kind of, like I said, these are harder to kind of pinpoint. Increasing cynical and negative outlook, and decreased satisfaction and sense of accomplishment. So going back to, they used to be really enthusiastic, and now they're like, yeah, it's great, but does it really make that big of a difference? A little bit harder to kind of define these or see these kind of in the outward perspective. But we can talk about some physical signs that may be a little bit easier to notice. So feeling tired and drained most of the time. They usually come in really energetic, ready to go to work, but they're like, oh, I'm dragging this morning. Lowered immunity, and they're sick frequently. So they used to come in 3 days a week. Now they're coming in 1 day a week because they're just like, I'm just not feeling good. Now, of course, we're taking sickness way more seriously. But still, that's one of those signs to look out for. Headaches and muscle pains. Maybe if they're asking if, does anyone have any Tylenol, or you can feel them kind of stretching and, aches and pains, kind of those moans that you hear and when people are more stiff and sore and have some pain. And change in appetite or sleep habits. Of course, you won't know their sleep habits unless they talk to you about it, but it might be, every time they come in, we have snacks maybe for some volunteers. Every time they come in, they grab a thing of crackers and a soda out of the fridge, and for the last 3 weeks, they haven't eaten anything while they volunteered. And they used to, have at least a couple snacks while they're doing their activities. Mental and behavioral signs, withdrawing from responsibilities. They used to be, more active, and they're saying, hey, I don't really want to do this anymore. I don't want to deliver the meals, but I'll help prep the meals, maybe. Isolating from others. They used to kind of be in the group, but then they're kind of off by themselves. Procrastinating kind of goes back to any kind of deadlines. Hey, I noticed, you need to have this article for the newsletter done next week. Have you started it? Oh, no, I'll do it, the day before, something along those lines. Using food, drugs, or alcohol to cope. Hopefully you're not seeing the drug or alcohol while they're volunteering, but you may, the lack of or overconsumption of food possibly. Taking frustrations out on others. So something little, they may explode a little bit more on you or another volunteer. We really need to watch out and make sure the frustrations aren't being taken out on our clients or people that we're serving. If that happens, that's a major sign, and that needs to be, I don't want to say confronted head on, but a conversation needs to happen quickly after an incident has been reported like that. And then kind of the big one that you'll be able to see is they're skipping work. They're not even telling you when they say that their route is scheduled, they're not even going to come in, or maybe they're coming in late, leaving early, not doing their full 3 hours that they committed or whatever. Those are some things that you can see more clearly. So there is something called the 3 R's approach to helping to combat burnout. So that is recognize, knowing, and being able to identify those warning signs that we just talked about. Reverse, to try and undo the damage by doing some stress management techniques or seeking some support, maybe some more self-care items. And I'm sure I can find some research if anyone wants some resources on some self-care strategies. And then resilience, taking care of your physical and emotional health. So some ways to deal with burnout that kind of goes along with that 3R approach. Reaching out to others, definitely being more sociable with coworkers in terms of volunteers. Instead of coworkers, your fellow volunteers. Limiting contact with negative people. Connecting with a cause or community group. Hopefully they're doing that with our programs. Finding new friends. Could be fellow volunteers, could be other people in the organization. Finding value in your work, where this may be having a conversation with you volunteer coordinators. If a volunteer is recognizing that they're getting burnt out, they may come to you and say, hey, I'm doing admin work, but I'm not really feeling like I'm contributing all that much. Am I helping you? Can you explain to me how this is helping you? And in that conversation, you may be able to figure out more challenging ways that we talked about earlier in getting them more involved. Finding a balance in your life, maybe a work-life balance, to where they may cut back on their volunteer hours, but they're also having that time to relax, socialize that they may not have had in the past. Making friends at work. Taking time off. Volunteers, I don't think, take advantage of this as much as what they could or should. And we don't necessarily want to encourage volunteers to take time off, but at the same time, to help combat burnout that may not be there but could possibly evolve, letting them know that it's okay if they want to take a week off of their meal route. Of course, letting you know well in advance so you can have time to fill those slots. But as someone mentioned in the comments a little bit earlier, Medicare open enrollment is a perfect example. So for our SHIP SMP program, between October, really September and December, volunteers are asked a lot. They're asked to make calls, they're asked to go to events, they're asked to do some really, really tough things. You're kind of holding someone's health insurance in the palm of your hand, and it's a lot of responsibility. It could be very stressful. So a lot of the volunteers, with that program, they're going to go really great and nice and hard, and they're going to do some amazing things for about 3 or 4 months, and then you may not hear from them for 2 or 3 months because they need that time off. It was so intense and chaotic that to prevent that burnout, they're going to take a little break, and then they may come back next open enrollment, or they may come back in the late spring, early summer. So just keeping that connection with them and saying, hey, you did great during open enrollment. I know you want to take some time off. Let me know when I can contact you for some volunteer positions or activities that we need filled. Reevaluate priorities, set boundaries. So maybe a volunteer who's worked too much may need to talk to you about, hey, I know I used to come in every day. I'm going to have to reduce that to Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And help them work, and you work a transition into, okay, well, we're used to you being here a lot. We understand. We want you to stick around, you know, and get those boundaries in place and make sure that they're being met. Take breaks from technology, nourish your creativity, set aside some relaxation time. So this could be during their volunteer time as they're volunteering with you. As a full-time employee, we get 2 15-minute breaks and an hour lunch break. Have we thought about that for volunteers? Do volunteers get similar breaks to that? Or if they're here for an 8-hour shift, we expect them to do volunteer work all 8 hours? I hope we don't do that. I don't think that we do that. But if a volunteer says, hey, you know, I need to take a walk, you know, they had that really tough call, or, you know, they stared at the computer and entered data or done filing for the last 3 hours, and they just need a little break. Okay, go take a walk, go have a lunch. You know, if you wouldn't mind being back in the next 15, 20 minutes, that'd be great, or kind of set up how your relaxation time priorities would go. And encourage them to get plenty of sleep. Healthy lifestyle choices. I am not the person to talk about healthy lifestyle choices. I need to take some of this advice myself. Make exercise a priority. Maybe you start a volunteer walking club, or your staff people have a little walking club. We used to do a 10-minute walk at 10 o'clock every morning at my office. So if you have volunteers in the office, or maybe at the senior center or wherever, hey, you want to join us on our walks? Or if you have a fitness class at the senior center, hey, do you want to take a break and go and do that? Or as long as it's not going to interfere with their role. Minimizing sugar, caffeine, trans fat, eat more fatty acids. I say go for that. I love caffeine, I love carbs, I love sugar. So again, I am not the poster child for those healthy lifestyle choices, but those are things that can help deal with the burnout. Maybe instead of 3 cups of coffee, you encourage them to only have 1 cup of coffee. So key takeaways from the presentation: define your retention rate. So make sure, like many of you said in the poll, we really need to figure out our time frame. Maybe it's 3 months, maybe it's 1 month. I know a program I used to work with, I used to say, if you don't have any volunteer activity for a year, they're considered inactive. And then they wouldn't contribute to the retention rate. Was that a good strategy? Probably not. You know, it may be, okay, if they volunteer during open enrollment every year, great. If they do at least 1 ride every month, they're retained, or however you guys want to structure it. Make sure it's defined and look at your rates in that way. Build the atmosphere of connection. All those making their voices heard, the validating comments, everything like that. Try and build that positive atmosphere. Question why volunteers don't stay. Those surveys. Remember those continuous improvement methods. Try and do that. Blasphemy, only 3 cups of coffee in the morning. Sorry, that was funny. I haven't even had a cup of coffee today. I don't know how I'm standing. So not only, but, you know, do those surveys and question volunteers as to why they don't stay. If you don't currently do exit interviews, try and implement those. Some of the volunteers exit and we don't realize it. So it could be really tough to do those interviews. But if you have a volunteer that says, hey, you know, due to unforeseen circumstances, I'm not going to be able to volunteer anymore. You know, we're sorry to hear that. Do you have time to schedule, you know, maybe a 10-minute phone call with me? Or if I send you a survey, would you be willing to fill it out just to kind of tell me a little bit about, you know, improvements that we can do I mean, there are factors of why volunteers don't stay that we can't control. They move away. Maybe it was a loss of a loved one, and they just need time to deal with their grief, and that's completely understandable. They may have become a caregiver for a family member, and that takes up, as we all know in our field, all of your time to be a caregiver, new work restraints, things like that. But just to know the reasons why and see if there's any trends. If it's, I really don't feel comfortable in working with certain volunteers, maybe not by name, but in a particular volunteer role, you can try to address that with the volunteer group as well. So seeing if there's any trends that pop up. And then it's okay to talk about burnout. So I have some articles, and there's a whole lot of things that are on the internet in the research that you can find on burnout. If you do volunteer update trainings, or you're trying to just do maybe a quarterly get together with volunteers, maybe not a focus group, or we talked about doing coffee with the coordinators, just kind of getting the volunteers more engaged in the program. One thing to talk about is burnout, and say, we don't want to burn you out. We tend to burn out the volunteers that we rely on the most. So, okay, this volunteer, she loves to make phone calls or does presentations, or, if someone cancels a meal route, I know I can always turn to this volunteer and they'll pick it up no matter what. Make sure you talk about it and let the volunteers know that if you're feeling a little bit burned out, or you're feeling that burnout is coming, it's okay to let me know. I had a volunteer one time that I accidentally almost made her resign, and I did not mean to. So she called me up, and she was really stressed out. She was having some problems at home with family members and things like that. And I said, hey, if you need to take a week off of volunteering, we'll understand. We want you to stick around. We know you have other priority, family is a priority over volunteering. If you need to take a little bit of time, just let us know. We'll get your shifts covered. It'll be fine. And she took that as, I knew you didn't like me, and I know you want me to stop volunteering, and maybe I'll just, fine, I quit. And she hung up on me. And I was like, well, shoot. Didn't use the word shoot. So I was like, okay, I meant to come at it at a different way, and maybe my tone of voice or something was really off, and she was offended by it. So I talked to my supervisor, told her what happened, and she said, give her a day or two and call her back and talk it out. So, let her sleep on it, kind of a thing. Called her back a couple days later. I apologized. She said, she took out that anger and that frustration out on me. One of the signs, those mental and behavioral signs, we had a really good conversation. She apologized. I apologized. We kind of got our points of view more in line, that I wasn't trying to push her out. And she ended up taking a week vacation from volunteering, came back, and she was more motivated. She wasn't as anxious about what she needed to do. She didn't feel as much pressure about having to, help everybody and their brother. So when you talk about burnout, some people may react in a negative way, know that it's coming, and relate to the volunteer that, it's coming from a good place. We want you to remain healthy. We want you to stay around longer. But kind of talking about it on the front end in a group setting, especially where a volunteer doesn't feel singled out that, oh, they're talking about me. They know that I'm not happy right now. But just, again, that sense of connection, that open communication where they can talk to you about the ways that they're feeling and possibly prevent a volunteer from leaving due to burnout. So that's all on volunteer retention for the presentation today. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat box, and I'll go over the questions here in a little bit. Just want to give you a couple updates like I do most every webinar. So we've had 2,419 volunteers reported across the state, which is fantastic. Again, we've reached our goal of 2,020 volunteers back in January. We've had some programs who reported volunteer data, in January and February, not report volunteer data the last few months. And I completely understand why. I'm not gonna, say, hey, why haven't you given me your stuff? There's multiple reasons. Volunteers are low. We're literally not doing a volunteer program right now, or it's on hold. But just kind of reminding you all, if you want to report some volunteer numbers, we're looking just for the number of volunteers you have per month and their volunteer hours. So we have increased our volunteer hours to almost 40,000 hours. And that number equates to, we've reached over the $1 million mark in in-kind contributions from our volunteers this year so far. So amazing, amazing work. Our numbers are only going to continue to increase. If you have any questions about how to report the data or what needs to be reported, feel free to shoot me an email, give me a call. I'm happy to talk that over with you if you're interested in reporting some data to me. I want to remind you guys about the Make a Difference Monday volunteer recognition social media campaign that we're doing. Thank you. Many of you who are on the webinar today have submitted at least one volunteer for this campaign. So we're good for posts through September 15th. So I'm really excited to say every single Monday from the beginning of January through the middle of September, we have been able to highlight at least one volunteer, if not a volunteer group or a volunteer couple, every week. So I'm really excited. The campaign has been amazing. I really appreciate you guys sending in your volunteers. We need a few more to make it a whole year. And I'm hoping we can continue this campaign for years to come if everyone's willing to help. With 2,400 volunteers, only 52 weeks in a year, we should be able to do it. Fingers crossed. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but I do want to really thank Keita Cole again for sharing the impact graphic that she used with everyone. I sent that out in last month's update. If you weren't on last month's webinar and you want that information, let me know. I can send you that editable the form where you can edit. It sounds weird saying editable. I think that is right, but it sounds weird. I can send you that document so you can use it for your programs. If you have any resources or if you've adjusted that resource to your program, I would love to see it. I know it's really exciting. I love to send things back to Keita and let her know that what she created is really having an impact across the state. Any other resources that you have, videos, anything like that you're willing to share, I would love to see them and brag on you. I'll brag again on Janet over at the Johnson County Senior Center. She and her volunteers were able to do almost an 8-minute video, I think, maybe 7 minutes and some odd seconds, that had volunteer testimonials and client testimonials and really great music and pictures, and it's just really, really great video. I encourage you all to look at the Johnson County Senior Center's Facebook page. I think yesterday you had over 3,500 views. It's probably way higher now. But it's just a really great video and more resources that you may be able to implement in your program to show the impact that you're having in your community. Or any other creative ideas that you have, I would love to know what they are, share them with the group so we can really get our recognition out and impact out so many different ways. We talked about volunteer recognition last webinar. Through the volunteer campaign, we wanted to do 9 in-person luncheons, volunteer luncheons. Unfortunately, this year we're not going to be able to do any in-person events. And we no longer have any funding to do any kind of trinkets or anything like that. So what we're looking at doing is more personalized thank you cards. And I know you all do this on the regular. So by no means are we asking you to do yet another thank you card to your volunteers. But what I want to offer you all is the opportunity for your volunteers to get a personalized thank you note from the state. So I'll be writing them out, handwriting them out. It's not going to be a form letter. I'm going to do my best to make it as personalized to the volunteer as possible. So if you're interested in that, let me know. I'm doing it currently for the Southwest My Ride folks. So I'm happy to do that for anyone else who's interested. I don't need, unless you want to give it to me, really all I need is the volunteer's first name. So that way, again, I can make it a little more personalized. I may ask you for some statistics and some data, either about the volunteer or just about the program in general, so I can really kind of make it personalized to the program. And then what I'll do is I'll write out those volunteer notes and I'll mail them back to you. And then you can either send them to the volunteers, or I know volunteer confidentiality is a huge thing. We're going to talk about it here in a couple webinars. I'm happy to mail the thank you notes to your volunteers personally if that's what you prefer, and you're comfortable with sending me their names and addresses. I promise I will keep them confidential and it will not be shared with anyone. But if you're not comfortable with that, first names, then I'll just send them to you. So if that's something that you're interested in, please let me know. I'm hoping we're going to be able to do something a lot bigger and a lot better in terms of volunteer recognitions for all the amazing programs that have submitted the data that you're seeing on the screen now. COVID, just like everyone else, it threw us for a big loop, and we're trying to do what we can with the limited resources that we have. So again, I hope you all will take me up on that offer. If not, I totally understand. Or if you can think of anything else that you want the state to do to help recognize your volunteers, please, please, please don't hesitate to let me know, and I will do what I can that's within my means to help you guys recognize those volunteers. Our next webinar is going to be Friday, August 21st, talking about re-engaging volunteers. It's my best friend and one of my niece's birthdays, so it's going to be a good day. I think it's going to be a good webinar. I hope you can join us again. Now I'm going to open it up for questions. So I don't see any questions that have come into the chat box. And what I'll do is I'm going to unmute some lines if I hear background noise. Oh, I just heard that August 21st is the infamous Keita Cole's birthday as well. So we're just going to have a big old birthday celebration. So happy birthday in advance, Keita. But I'm unmuting lines, so if anyone has any questions or comments or stories that they'd like to share. Almost everybody. Oh, getting some feedback. All right, so if we don't have any questions or anyone wants to share any of their stories, no problem. Thank you all so much for being on the webinar today. Look forward to talking to you next month, and anytime you need anything, feel free to give me a call, shoot me an email. My information's on the screen. I'm happy to help in any way that I can. Thank you all so much. I'll be on for a little bit longer, and I'm going to stop the recording now.